ADA 30 Idaho. Interview Series. Greg Liebach. Interviewed by Stephen Snow.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Idaho's 30-year celebration of the ADA. This is one of several interviews in our interview series. I'm happy you're able to join us in watching today's interview. I'm Stephen Snow, the Executive Director with the Idaho Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and I'm thrilled and honored to have my good friend Greg Liebach join us today. Obviously, our primary focus for the interview is discussing DPN, the Deaf President Now movement, and how that correlates with the ADA. But before we proceed, I want to give some brief background on Greg. Greg was a well-known student leader during the Deaf President Now protests. And in fact, Greg's leadership led to ABC News recognizing Greg as a Person of the Week during the protests, which is a huge honor. Greg received his JD degree from Hofstra University, and he's also had several wonderful careers throughout the years. Most recently, he's the former bureau chief for the Federal Communications Commission in the Disability Rights Office, dealing with federal telecommunications. Currently, he serves as the CLO, Chief Legal Officer, for a video relay service company known as ZVRS, and he's also a member of the Board of Trustees for Gallaudet University. So welcome, Greg.
Hello, Stephen. I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
Wonderful. Now, before we dive right in, I want to take a moment to show a few photos that were taken during the Deaf President Now protests.
Here we have a picture of Greg speaking in front of the media with the crowd behind him, and a picture of students on campus at the protest. And here is a picture of the students carrying the We Still Have a Dream banner. And next we'll show a clip from the ABC News Person of the Week interview.
Our Person of the Week. It is not very often we can say with much accuracy that a week has been a watershed, but this one has. This week, millions of us have had the chance to sit forward in our chairs and watch a group of young people as they break down some very out-of-date stereotypes.
Deaf people are capable of anything except that they can't hear.
Greg Liebach is president of the student government at Gallaudet University. He has been instrumental in bringing down a university president who is neither deaf nor able to speak sign language. He has also helped to raise the national consciousness about deaf people.
It's become a nationwide issue and a nationwide focus, and not only for deaf people, but for other people.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. Those photos gave me chills. It's really remarkable to look back and realize that it's been 32 years. It feels like the blink of an eye and those years have flown by. From then until now, in the year 2020, so much has changed since DPN. I've got my questions on my list, and that's where I'm looking when I glance off screen. So tell me more about what exactly your involvement was in DPN, and secondly, how you feel DPN impacted the inception of the ADA.
Wow, certainly. It's really hard to encapsulate it all within a few minutes, but I'll try my best to summarize it. So at that time of the protests, I was serving as the president of the student body government. And what led to the protests was many events, but really a series of key moments. And one of those that initially triggered the discussion was when the National Association of the Deaf, or NAD, published an article in the NAD Broadcaster that posed the question, why don't we have a deaf president? We certainly could. Within that article, it named several potential candidates, and that included 40 deaf candidates who had a PhD and had the qualifications for the job. And that triggered the discussion on campus. And it also sparked the creation of a young male deaf alumni association called the Ducks, and my brother was actually a member of that original group. So this was in the fall of 1987, and that is when Dr. Lee, the current president of Gallaudet, announced his resignation. So that discussion continued until I decided to run for student body government president, and I was elected, and a few days after that, we began planning for the protest. Well, really, at that time, we were planning for a rally. We were trying to garner more support, as much support as possible. And at that time, there were a lot of doubts in people's minds if a deaf person could truly do this job. Of course, the president had to interact with Congress, had to do fundraising, so there were some doubts. So we were successful in gathering support, and the protest began. The week of the actual protest started on Sunday, March 6th, and went through that Friday. It was that day that we had our march to the Capitol. The day before, on that Thursday, Dr. Zinsser, who was the hearing president that had been appointed that we were protesting, officially announced their resignation, and the next day we marched to Capitol Hill. And along the way, there were many senators and congressmen who joined the march and gave passionate speeches at the Capitol to show their support. It was then that we got the attention of Capitol Hill and the attention of senators and congressmen, which helped establish the long-lasting relationship we have with Capitol Hill.
Oh, wow. You know, interesting enough, after President Zinsser was pushed out and resigned, she took a position as the president for the University of Idaho, for those who weren't aware. And strangely enough, a few months after being president, she actually visited the Idaho School for the Deaf, and I ended up meeting her there. I told her about how my brother was at Gallaudet during the protests, and understandably that was an awkward time for her, so not much was said. Thanks for sharing about your involvement. Now let's discuss the impact that DPN had on the ADA. The ADA wasn't enacted without any prior background. There had to be several events that led to the ADA's inception. So tell me a little bit about how DPN impacted the ADA.
Yes. Well, first I should explain that the Americans with Disabilities Act language and many of its points are modeled after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Much of the language is very similar and is tailored to disability rights. Another key piece of legislation is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So this act applied to federal agencies who provided programs to citizens and ensured that those programs were accessible to individuals with disabilities. And that is modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. During the 80s, there were many advocates, one of those key advocates being Justin Dart, who is now considered the father of the ADA, wanted to establish something like the Americans with Disabilities Act. So after Deaf President Now happened in 1988, we had the world's attention, and we had legislators' attention. It was at that point that they reached out to I. King Jordan, the president at Gallaudet, and said, "What can we do for you?" So at that point, we had to strike the iron while it was hot, while we still had the world's attention. So we got connected with them and worked on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So after Deaf President Now, I. King Jordan was elected as president on March 13th. And 2 weeks later was the appropriations hearing. I believe it was in the House of Representatives. So President I. King Jordan asked me to go with him to that. And honestly, upon entering the room, there was an uproar of applause that lasted for 5 minutes. It was so thrilling to finally see a deaf person in that role. After investing in Gallaudet University for over 126 years, there was finally a deaf president. So I. King Jordan gave his budget presentation, and I honestly had chills from that. And after that, there were many senators who came up to him, like allies like Senator McCain and Ted Kennedy and Senator Tom Harkin, who was a great ally, and as you know, whose brother was deaf, and Congressman Bonnier, who was from Michigan and served on the board at Gallaudet, as well as Congressman Gunderson from Wisconsin. So we gathered a lot of support, and that's really what got the ball rolling, and what eventually led to the ADA. So this happened in 1988, and then in 89, the bill for the Americans with Disabilities Act was presented. So before the bill was brought to the floor, there were several hearings for people to testify in support of the ADA. And at that time, the National Law Center on Deafness was at Gallaudet. Yes, I believe that's what it's called, the National Law Center on Deafness. It has since been moved under NAD, but at that time it was at Gallaudet, and a lawyer by the name of Karen Peltz Strauss had approached me as president of the student body government and asked if I would testify in support of the ADA. She told me that she was seeking written testimony, so at that point I started to think what I would present about one of the 5 key titles of the ADA, and the 4th is telecommunication access. At that time there were a few states that did offer relay services via TTY. However, these were volunteer-based, most were set up in church basements and were not funded. I wanted to see a nationwide 24/7 relay service. So at that time I thought of my brother's experience when he had applied for a job at Merrill Lynch. During the interview, the person asked my brother how he would bring in hearing clients. So my brother said that that was a good question, and he said that he would work with deaf clients and could get clients that way. But he felt like at that time it was honestly like the Berlin Wall, like a block between him and the hearing world. He could call through a relay service, but honestly you would have to wait for a long time to get that. So I decided to incorporate that story into my testimony, and I explained that if there was a 24/7 relay service available, this would generate many deaf jobs. And I explained that that was much like the Berlin Wall, how that blocked our access to the world. And it's ironic that I testified this in October of 1989, and then in November, 1 month later, that's when the Berlin Wall came down. So that summer, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990.
So during your testimony, what was the committee's reaction?
Oh, really, they were very engaged, very attentive, and asked a lot of questions. Normally they come in just to do their duty and don't pay a lot of attention, but for us, they asked us a lot of questions. We really had the attention of the full House. And on the Senate side, we had Kennedy, Tom Harkin, Lowell Waker from Connecticut, as well as Senator McCain, so 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So this was definitely a bipartisan piece of legislation. Both were very much in support of this. The Republicans were more concerned to know that this legislation would actually create jobs. So of course Title I takes care of that. So including that, this legislation was definitely had bipartisan support.
Oh, wow. I'm sure now, looking back on your involvement, not only with DPN, but with the ADA as well, that legislation impacts you on a personal level. What is that like for you, having experience before and after the ADA?
Yes, really, I would not have the position I'm in today if it weren't for the ADA. It's as simple as that. I grew with the ADA. It was passed, and before I knew it, I received a job because of what the ADA did. And there are many people with disabilities who are in the same shoes that I am, especially in the communications industry. That boomed after the ADA. We started with the TTY and moved to telerelay, to IP caption phones, to video relay service, and VRS companies. And that was all because of the ADA. And because of Title IV of the ADA, the FCC was charged with overseeing telecommunications relay, and as well as captions, but that was actually passed under another piece of legislation later on. My point being that Title IV of the ADA charged the FCC with supporting these services, which forced them to establish a Disability Rights Office. I began as a lawyer there in 2001 and worked my way up to become the chief of the Disability Service Office. And it is now a strong and vibrant office, and it is run by a deaf individual named Susie Rosen Singleton. And honestly, that's all because of the ADA, and that has had such a positive impact on so many people. Of course, the ADA does have some gaps, some things that need to be fixed. Of course, there's more work to be done. But the ADA is what really set the stage, and is what allowed us to build upon it. There are many other pieces of legislation, many court decisions that point to the ADA as the foundation of the rights of individuals with disabilities. It is so important.
Oh, absolutely. I think the ADA is our most referred to piece of legislation for anything related to deaf access, programs, and services alike. And in fact, so much of my office work involves referring to the ADA and its requirements, and if we didn't have it, that would pose significant challenges.
I'd also like to add that recently, NAD decided to file a lawsuit against the White House for not providing access to deaf individuals through sign language interpreters during the president's press conferences regarding COVID-19 and general press conferences regarding the health and safety of individuals. Really, at these press conferences, a sign language interpreter should be provided so that deaf individuals have access, and everyone has access to this information. So this was actually filed under the basis of the ADA.
Oh yeah, I agree with you. I'm curious to see what the results of the suit will be. I'm hoping for a positive outcome. So, obviously, the ADA is a huge benefit to the deaf community. No questions about it. But does the ADA benefit society in general? And if so, how?
Yes, certainly. And I'm sure that you've heard the many examples of this, such as the example of the requirement to remove physical barriers. An example of that being is that many ramps have been set in place and curbs have had to be replaced with ramps, and that not only benefits individuals in wheelchairs, but it also benefits women who are pushing baby carriages or people on bicycles. So not only benefits those in wheelchairs, but others as well. So these were kind of the positive unintended consequences of the passage of the ADA. Another example is with captions. Like I mentioned before, the requirement for captions wasn't provided for within the ADA, but that was the basis of the legislation for it. It not only benefits those who are deaf or hard of hearing, but for senior citizens who have lost hearing later in life, or individuals who English is their second language. In addition to this, the Americans with Disabilities was the basis for access to education for children with disabilities and children who are deaf.
That makes me think about how many deaf people are incredibly intelligent and have considerable skills that they're able to contribute. For example, there are countless scientists that are deaf and so on. The ADA has given them the opportunity to be contributing members of society.
Yes, and actually, that reminds me of the perfect example of that. Now, during COVID-19, individuals are using clear masks to be able to see each other better. Those were actually invented by a deaf individual. Not only are they benefiting deaf people, but they are benefiting people at large.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many hearing people I meet that struggle hearing and understanding with masks on, and there's a feeling of disconnect So I'm seeing that the clear masks not only benefit deaf people, but the general hearing population too. As you mentioned, the ADA has 5 titles, and the first 4 are the most important. But let's talk about Title I for a moment, regarding employment. Employment is key for positive quality of life for the deaf community. And having employment means that deaf people can purchase vehicles, houses, and so on, and it truly is key. But the recent trends have been 60 to 70% of the deaf community shows that they're under or unemployed. That's a drastically high percentage, and in fact, it's the highest percentage of under and unemployment compared to other disability communities. So the ADA has some wonderful benefits, but it's only made a small dent in the unemployment issue. So how can we, as deaf community members, use the ADA to reduce that percentage? Do you have any ideas or suggestions?
This issue comes with many fronts, one being advocacy work. DGM, the Deaf Grassroots Movement, has done a tremendous amount of work on increasing the opportunities for deaf individuals in employment. But again, it comes back to attitude. One of the largest barriers in the way of deaf employees being hired is the cost of interpreters. There needs to be more training conducted in order to highlight and show these companies that when they hire a deaf person, they should view them as an asset to the company and not a burden due to those interpreting costs. So there needs to be a change in that frame of thinking. Based on my observations, deaf employees are extremely loyal. The turnover rate for deaf employees is very low. Once a deaf individual is hired, they typically stay there for a long time, and they have a lot of pride in their work. I have seen many examples in that in my personal life, and they have so much to contribute to society. Some companies, such as Amazon, are growing now because they have increased their entry level of payment to $15 an hour with benefits for part-time and full-time employees. And with this, they've hired more deaf employees. So that is on the blue-collar side, but the same applies to professional level jobs. There has been an increase in deaf individuals in these positions. When I became a lawyer, there were only a handful of deaf lawyers, and now there's around 300. There are more support services being provided that are opening doors. There are also more deaf doctors and other deaf professionals. But you're right, if you look at the unemployment rate percentage-wise, it definitely is a challenge. And honestly, we have to tackle this from several fronts. One organization that I really have to commend for their work in employment opportunities for deaf individuals is NAD. They have done so much to provide job opportunities for deaf individuals, but honestly, they can't do it alone. They have many issues on their agenda, including issues in education, issues with interpreting, and now they have also tackled employment. We need to be able to create more advocacy to create more employment opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's something we will always continue to work on, trying to find solutions and improvement on the issue. I guess we aren't in the clear and there's always work to be done. I want to jump topics a bit to Title IV regarding telecommunication. You were the former bureau chief at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and you're currently the chief legal officer at ZVRS. So what has your view been on telecommunications, how it's evolved over the years to what we have now, especially from your perspective working for the FCC and now a VRS company? Have you seen any impact the ADA has had on telecommunications for the deaf community? If so, how, and what are the types of changes that you've noticed?
If you take a look at Title IV of the Americans with Disabilities Act, there is specific language within the legislation that states that relay services must be available and accessible 24/7 nationwide. This means that what the FCC offers must be available to everyone, and that the service must be functionally equivalent to a voice call that a person who can hear makes. So the experience of a deaf individual, an individual with a speech disability, an individual who is deafblind, who uses those relay services should have the same functionally equivalent experience as an individual who can hear. It's interesting to see how that has evolved over time and how that has changed with technology. In 1990, when the ADA was passed, the TTY was considered the gold standard for relay services because that was a technology that was available. It wasn't until video became available that that was then used within the video relay service with interpreters for deaf individuals. Another way it's evolved is with IP-based relay. In 1990, there wasn't IP-based relay. It wasn't developed until the late 90s, and then it was piloted by a company in 98. And after that, the FCC recognized it as a service. As an agency, the FCC has been very accommodating in how we interpret that statement within the ADA in order to meet and continue to meet the needs of the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I really do have to commend them for the support that they have shown in that and how flexible they have been. It's interesting as well that internally there was some tension within the FCC. When Relay first started, our budget was $35 million. So this was for tele-relay services for calls from state to state. Within state, that was funded by the state itself. And now that budget has grown to almost $2 billion. And part of that is because everything within relay services is IP-based, which means that states are no longer responsible for paying within state calls, but everything is within federal jurisdiction. Although $2 billion seems like an astronomical number, we should not be misled by that. We really have to look at the efficiency in which that money is spent, and we have to also look at the outcomes that relay service has created for deaf individuals. It has had a positive impact on people and has created many jobs. I wish that I had a study to show that benefit, because honestly, when an individual who knows nothing about relay services comes in and sees that number, they almost fall to the ground. You really have to look at the return on investment. And honestly, in the long run, it saves the government money because it creates jobs for deaf individuals, which means they'll use less social services later on.
Yes, shifting away from the welfare state and becoming independent. Yeah. So we're getting close on time here. I want to wrap up with this last question. Obviously now, dealing with COVID-19, things have really shaken the deaf community, with mask mandates making communication even more challenging, quarantine causing increased isolation for deaf community members, and most deaf children and deaf people rely on that socialization in schools and in the community. Having to stay home severely limits their ability for communication access. I'm wondering how the ADA can alleviate some of the issues that have come to light during COVID-19, because right now it feels like an uphill battle. With the current situation, how can we reprioritize access issues for the deaf community?
Well, let's start by imagining if this pandemic was happening before the existence of the internet. We would feel so much more isolated, and it's tough to even imagine, especially considering how deaf individuals as a culture value human interaction and value physical touch. I remember in 1977, we were living in New York City, and there was a blackout, and my parents, of course, are deaf, and so they didn't have access to information. Fortunately, they went out and saw that there was a car on with people huddled around it, and they had the car radio on. And one of my parents' neighbors was writing everything down and showing it to my parents so that they had some information about what was going on. So that was the only access to emergency information during the blackout. So imagine if COVID-19 had happened during a time such as that. We would have felt so much more isolated. Thanks to technology such as video conferencing systems and video conferencing platforms like Zoom, we're able to keep in touch and we're able to communicate with the world. And still, we are noticing some access issues during this time. Currently, video platform systems such as Zoom are not compatible with the video relay service. This means that if a deaf individual is participating in a virtual meeting, they have to have a separate screen that has the interpreter on it. They aren't yet integrated. In an ideal world, and the Federal Communications Commission is definitely aware of this, their service should be compatible with all of those platforms. Currently, all video relay service companies' technology is compatible with one another. And unlike that, FaceTime, Zoom, and other platforms are not compatible with each other. Until COVID, people who can hear were very resistant to using video platforms. Typically, if they joined a meeting, they would block off their camera and only join via audio. Now we're seeing that more hearing individuals are willing to have that face-to-face communication, even though it's virtual. So in that regards, COVID is pushing us forward in those gains that we're making. I would say we definitely are more isolated during this time in terms of social events. However, with that, we've been exposed to more online forums and seminars that various organizations are hosting, and one of those being the Black Lives Matter movement that has moved online. And with that, we've been able to learn about the issues that they're facing through online platforms. So even though, of course, COVID-19 is a horrendous time, there are some silver linings. And it truly is awful that Black individuals are experiencing this oppression, and that it's taken that for us to recognize that systemic racism does exist. But now that we recognize that and see that, now we can do something about it. I also want to mention that during Deaf President Now, you've probably seen the picture of us carrying the banner that says, "We still have a dream." That banner was actually borrowed from the AME Church in Washington, D.C., and that was the same banner that was used during the Civil Rights Movement and during Martin Luther King's march. So it was an honor to be able to borrow that. Historically, when you look back at the passage of the ADA, and when you look back at Deaf President Now, you see a lot of white individuals. But honestly, the intentions of the ADA and the intentions of Deaf President Now were to benefit every individual, regardless of race. We see now the movement of deaf, Black, Indigenous, and people of color pressing for more employment opportunities. So it's obvious to see that there is more work to be done, that the ADA is not complete, and that we still need to remove the barriers that exist in racism within our system.
Yeah. Going back to your comment about Zoom and other video platforms, my dream would be a tech company creating some type of extension or a plugin that a VRS interpreter could join the meeting in that way. I think that would be great. But I think COVID really can create an environment for innovation to maximize our accessibility. But anyway, thank you so much for your time and your comments. We've learned so much about how DPN had a direct impact on the ADA, and really how the ADA benefits us all. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. And for our viewers, please share this video, and don't forget to use the hashtag ADA30Idaho. And thank you again, Greg, for joining us today.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you so much. A word collage in the shape of the United States with the word access highlighted and hashtag thanks to the ADA.